If you are wondering what Zone 2 is, how to determine your Zone 2, and why it is gaining popularity as a buzzword in the running community, you're in the right place. We'll explore the concept of polarized training, high-intensity interval training, and how Zone 2 fits into your training routine. Additionally, we'll discuss different models of zone classifications, such as the 3-zone, 5-zone, and 7-zone models. You'll discover different ways to work out your threshold, as well as the misconception that Zone 2 training will make you slower. So let's first delve into what Zone 2 is.
Dev, training to different zone models, we've used that often, and we particularly focus on Zone 2 from a building aerobic engine, aerobic capacity, but it has become a little bit of a buzzword within the running community. So maybe just to start off, can you just give a good explanation as to what Zone 2 really means?
Yeah, and I like the way that you said buzzword, because I mean Zone 2 training and the idea of low intensity or aerobic training really has been around for many, many years. So it isn't anything new, but it has become this buzz term that everyone's now all of a sudden starting to talk about it and discuss it in coffee shops and those sort of things. And really what we're trying to determine here is, or trying to get across, is that it is actually just a way of measuring an intensity. So it's a way of quantifying your intensity and ensuring we are keeping intensities low. So Zone 2, again, depending on what zone models, and we'll touch on the different models just now, but really about quantifying your effort levels and how do you implement that then into your training.
You're talking about quantifying intensity. So, you know, what metrics are we using and what are we talking about?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. People will often say Zone 2 and all they know is heart rate because their heart rate watch will tell them Zone 2. But intensity, as I mentioned, is any measure of quantifying that. So that can be heart rate, it can be pace. So percentages of threshold pace, for example. It can be power. A lot of runners are using power meters these days as well. So power is another way of measuring intensity. And then the subjective view is that rate of perceived exertion, so the RPE scale as well. So all of those are different methodologies to measure and quantify intensity, but they all should also speak the same language. So they should all fit into their correlating Zone 2s, if that makes sense.
Okay, Dave, that all makes a lot of sense. And because Zone 2 is such an important part of building aerobic capacity as endurance runners, we always or very often get this question, well, what is my Zone 2? How do I calculate that? How do I work it out?
There are many ways to skin a cat, as I suppose with anything. And within various test methodologies, there are several other ways of doing it and several protocols. So I talk about different ways of testing things. We at Coach Parry like to refer to threshold and work off threshold often. There's different ways of determining what threshold is, whether that's threshold heart rate, threshold pace. We use things like a time trial, so a 5K time trial. Again, it's largely dependent on the level of athletes. So some athletes will take sub 20 minutes to run 5Ks, and that doesn't really give us an accurate enough threshold, where other athletes might run a 30, 35 minute. So from a threshold test point of view, we generally will recommend a 30 to 40 minute type of all-out effort, and an average value, whether that's heart rate, pace, based on that gives us a rough indication and a relatively good threshold value to work from. So if we're using threshold, for example, we'll then use an 80% of threshold heart rate, or 75 to 85% of threshold pace, for example. So those would usually be using thresholds as your test. There are different ramp tests, which you would do more often in a lab. So on a treadmill, lab-based tests where we're pushing you to max. Then we start working on percentages of maximum. All of those are different ways to determine really the same thing. It's, again, comes down to that quantifying a value so that when you are out there training, you are working according to some guideline that you know what sort of intensity to work, and instead of just going out thumb sucking and going as hard as you can most of the time.
You mentioned earlier that there are different models for Zone 2, right? So there is a 3-zone model, a 5-zone model, a 7-zone model, depending on who you're talking to, really, different zone models. So are all Zone 2s created equally? Surely Zone 2 in this model, it means something different to Zone 2 in the 7-zone model.
Yeah, so, and that's really a good point. And I suppose why things like data can often confuse the issue, especially around training. But it becomes quite important that regardless of what model you are using, remember we are still referring to an effort level. And the idea of a zone 2 effort should be that easy type of effort. So if we're talking a zone 3 model, for example, zone 3 model is a very simplified way of measuring intensity. So we'll talk zone 1 is easy, zone 2 is kind of a tempo moderate effort level if you'd like, and then zone 3 is an all-out effort. And that's really simplified. Zone 5, which is something that we really use more of, is zone 1 being almost recovery type of work, zone 2 being your easy, still aerobic type of focus, and then we focus a lot on, and I know we'll touch on it, but polarized training, where you're then jumping to the opposite end of the scale and working upper end of zone 4s or zone 5s, depending on what the session entails. So there's almost a bit of a no man's land or a gray area that we try and avoid in that training. And then you've got the 7 zone model, which I often try and steer away from, because I find with athletes that overcomplicates things. We start talking about zone 1A, zone 1B, and zone 5B and 6. And so those sort of things then start really complicating, because it becomes that much more intense. And this is all, there's blurred lines when it comes to physiology. Nothing ever works as a switch.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and I think that's the key thing as well, is that as we are working with it, all of these zones are saying the same thing essentially, but just different models. And when you have the zone 7 model as an example, one of the reasons we don't like using that for, like what Dev says, is athletes like to believe in absolute black and white lines, and physiology just doesn't work like that. So they want to then go from zone 5 to zone 6, which their body doesn't actually exist in that sort of way. Like Dev said, they're very, very blurred lines.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so talking, for example, I spoke to a client recently who wanted to know zone 2 heart rate, and we're working on pacing, and he wants to know what heart rate is. And I had to also explain to him that in the prescription of his plan, his easy runs focusing on pace is still his zone 2 pace. And what's really important here, we talk about quantifying and the different ways of quantifying it, or different modalities like power, heart rate, they still need to speak the same language. So that's why we do things like field tests and time trials and that. So your percentage of threshold zone 2 heart rate should correlate to a zone 2 pace, should correlate to a zone 2 power, and then the perceived effort when we're talking about that. So all of that still needs to speak the same language. It shouldn't be, and that's often where things like devices have default settings and people don't always get that right.
Dev, let's just go back to this physiology, black and whites, blurred lines things, because this is really one of the things that people, I don't want to say get wrong, but confuse matters with. Okay, so physiology, the way our physiology works is that we never just flick a switch and go from aerobic to anaerobic. That doesn't happen. Like Dev says, it's a continuum, or a very blurred lines as to when you do that. While you're sitting watching this video, you are using both your aerobic and your anaerobic capacity systems or physiological systems. It's not like one just goes from one to the other. When you start sprinting, it's going to be ATP, and then only endurance is it aerobic. These things are constantly working all the time, and it's very important to know that zone 1 and zone 2 isn't a flick switch, and so you don't move from zone 1, flick a switch, and go into zone 2. So let's say, for example, you have your zone 2 heart rate set between 125 and 138. If you are running and your heart rate on your watch shows you 139, are you now out of zone 2?
No, and I think that's probably something that scares people a lot, and they don't understand that, because like you say, these values are quite fluid. There's a little bit of blurred lines, gray areas around that. And I think it comes down to devices more often than not. There's default settings on your device. So if we take the default settings out, and even if you've customized your settings based on your heart rate zones, based on your pace zones, you'll still go out for a run, attempting a zone 2 run. You may have had a cup of coffee in the morning, you may be a little bit more anxious, and your heart rate is slightly higher. And like you say, if the upper limit of your zone 2 is 138, how a device works is if it goes to 139, it bumps it into zone 3. The problem with that is, it's not to say you were doing your entire run in zone 3 and you were not getting the physiological benefits, because 1 beat per minute or 2 beats per minute really has almost an insignificant impact on what your physiology is doing. So I think that's something people need to understand a little bit, that this is a fluid, a moving thing. Your zone 2 changes, and that's why we do retests and time trials and those sort of things quite regularly, because those values do change from time to time and season to season as well.
And just to add to that, I think that's why it's really, really important to use your rate of perceived exertion with your metric of your heart rate or your pace or your power. Because if your heart rate's telling you you're not in zone 2 anymore, but you feel like that run is really easy, conversational, that you can really burst into song or something, then use those 2 metrics to really determine whether or not that you are in that zone specifically.
And I think that's actually something that goes amiss. We often forget the subjective feeling because we're so focused on devices and data these days that we ignore how we feel on a run. If we've had a really good run, but our watch doesn't say something, we come home and we're grumpy because we really think it wasn't productive enough. All right, so we know the physiology side of things now, but how do we implement this into our training? Sort of what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so zone 2 training is important. We mentioned that is, building our aerobic engines. And if we're endurance runners, that's what we want to be doing. But just doing zone 2 training is also equally not going to make you a much better runner. So we believe here at Coach Perry in a polarized training model. So 80% of your training to be done in this zone 2, this easy kind of running, and 20% of that training to be higher intensity, really tapping into some of that faster interval sort of training. And that sort of basis, or that the 80-20 principles, can adjust slightly depending on your experience as a runner, the ability, your running ability, your age, and how long you've been running for. So all of those things can adapt slightly. So let's say you haven't been running for very long, you're very new to running. Now we want to focus on building your engine. So we would spend a little bit more time in this zone 2, in this easy sort of area, and only every now and then focus on perhaps, you'd be working maybe more 95% zone 2 and 5% of the higher intensity work. And equivalently on the other end of that scale, perhaps you're a sub 3-hour marathoner, and then you will really be focusing on 80% zone 2, 20% slightly more higher intensity work. I use the word easy. So when we're talking zone 2 or 80% easy of your training, and this is such a key thing because, so often people use the word, oh, you must run slower. And we're runners. We don't like to be told we have to go slower. So I think it's key that we start talking rather about keeping your runs easy when we're talking around rate of perceived exertion, and not slowing down, because it doesn't necessarily mean always slowing down. It means keeping things easy, right?
Exactly that. So you say we don't like running slower, and in essence, we're trying to slow you down from that effort point of view. But I think changing the language to running easy, remember, easy is going to be relative. So what's my easy and Kipchoge's easy from an effort level might still be easy, but we're running at very different paces. So that's quite an important thing. I think it's more about managing effort. We need to speak about easy as a way of how do we manage our effort, and that comes back to whether it's pace or heart rate, and the RPE being a really big one is managing effort and knowing, right, I'm going out on that run, I'm not pushing myself too hard. I'm running easy today, I'm not running slow necessarily.
I love what you've just said now, because that's exactly it. We always get so much pushback around people saying, well, surely if I'm running slower, it's just going to make me slower. So we're not necessarily talking about running slower.
Remember, zone 2 training is not about getting slower, it's about running easy and optimizing your aerobic capacity. Whether you prefer polarized training or high intensity interval training, incorporating zone 2 workouts into your running routine will take your running to the next level. Watch this video to find out why running easy will not make you slower.